Hello, my name is Liz, and I am a former Fundie. Yes, that's right. I was extremely fundamentalist Christian. I was a pastor and a missionary for a good chunk of my life. And now I'm an atheist. In this video, I'm going to recount my experience from apostle to apostate. Enjoy. I will no longer be silent. I'll no longer sit by the wayside, mourning over the time that I've lost and how I was duped. What I want to do now is provide an example and a safe place for people who find themselves in situations similar to what I was going through. I always thought I was sure. I had this absolute certainty of what I was meant to be and what I was supposed to do with my life. I spent every part of my being working towards the goal of becoming a missionary. I gave up a full ride scholarship to my state school in engineering so that I could go to a Bible college dressed in university's clothing to get a degree as a missions major, where I learned no real applicable skills. I believed down to my core that I was wicked and evil, that there was no redeemable part of me. Every achievement, every accomplishment, any good thing that happened in my life, I attributed to God's grace and favor on me. And anytime things went bad, or I was struggling health-wise, mentally, physically, that was my fault. I lacked the faith, or I was sinful. I had times in my life where I was incredibly bitter. I have no intention about making this channel, if it goes anywhere, about my mental health or my physical health. But I have a lot that's wrong with me. Some of it, like my complex PTSD from my upbringing and religious trauma, and other physical things like lovely genetic disorders and fibromyalgia. And I spent a lot of time asking God why he would make me like this, because this seemed a lot more than Paul's thorn in the flesh that he prayed 3 times for God to take away, and God told him, "My grace is sufficient for you." And I tried to live off of that belief that God's grace was truly sufficient for me. But it was so confusing to me because I was put into this body that requires extra maintenance, that gets worn down and sick very easily. But then God puts this calling on my life and asks me to do things that regularly push me to and past what should be healthy limits and boundaries. And I would pray and pray and pray for God, not to heal me entirely, but just to take one of the things off my plate. And every time that I didn't receive healing, I would internalize it. Because my mind would go to, well, do I not have enough faith for God to heal me? Or do I not deserve to be healed? Is this punishment? If God were to take away some of my ailments, would I then become prideful? And instead of people seeing God working through me, they would just see me. But it was really hard. right before I got to the point of deconstructing my faith, I really felt like I was in this abusive relationship where God was this demanding taskmaster, and I'm just stumbling along doing my best to try to fulfill his will, but my mental health is completely gone to shit, and I'm getting sick, almost every week from the levels of stress and anxiety that I was feeling. And I didn't have any good support outside of my husband, who is incredibly just amazing. But when I told my mom that I was taking time off for my mental health, she gets all serious, looks at me, and says, "Oh, Liz, you can't put God's plan on hold. You just need to keep walking in his perfect plan for you and trust him to see you through." And I think part of it is she very much believes that we are in the very last of the last days, and that if I'm not out on the mission field right now sharing the gospel, that I'm gonna miss out on doing God's calling, because God's gonna come back, tomorrow, this week, next week, and I won't be out doing what he asked me to do because I took time off for my mental health. Allegedly, when I was a small child, I would wake up crying, and when my mom would come ask me what I was crying about, apparently I said that I was dreaming of the faces of people that God wanted me to reach, to share him with, but I was crying because I didn't know where they were, how to get to them, what language they were speaking, etc. And so apparently I was called to missions at such a young age. I fully believed that. I don't think necessarily that my mom is lying to me, but I think way too much stock was put into a young child having night terrors. I actually don't remember a time of accepting Jesus into my heart. I just always believed that. Apparently, I was always praying as a child, and allegedly I had this very close relationship with God, to the point that when my mom was pregnant with my little brother, before doctors were able to determine if it was a boy or a girl, I informed my mom that I was having a little brother, and that I knew because God told me he was going to be a brother. I grew up Pentecostal, and so speaking in tongues was a thing. And that's another one that I've done for as long as I remember. Looking back, it was probably a learned habit because my mom spoke in tongues on the regular. And so if you're a little kid and you're learning, as you're learning language, you're learning English, but then your mom is also speaking this other made up gibberish language, you're going to learn to make similar noises. And when you do that, and it's encouraged because your parents are just so shocked that you're already baptized in the Holy Spirit, oh my gosh, you're going to continue to repeat that behavior, and it's going to be reinforced at that point. And so from that extremely young age, there were never any other options. There was never a what else do I want to do with my life? It was, what specifically do I want to do and be as a missionary, reaching unreached people groups? Even down to the circumstances of my birth. So my parents were trying and trying to have a baby with no success. And my mom went to the doctor, and she was told, at least her recollection, she was told that that she was infertile and that she would never be able to have children. And she rebuked the doctor, saying, I rebuke that. I will have a baby when God wants me to have a baby. And as the story goes, a few months later, she found out that she was pregnant with me. And so because of that, it was kind of put into my head that I was this Samuel-like figure, that my mom was Hannah and she wasn't able to have a baby. She dedicated that God was in control of that situation, and then God gave her me, this child that was going to be completely dedicated to the Lord and serve him her whole life. And so because of that, because of this calling led to believe that I put my entire life towards that. I went on short-term trips as a high schooler. That was my entire focus in college. And I worked so hard. I pushed myself incredibly. After college, I moved back in with my parents, which was a very toxic situation for me, and worked 2 jobs. Monday through Friday, I worked a 40-hour-a-week secular job with fairly regular overtime. And concurrent with that, I was the children, youth, music, and women's pastor for the local church. And it was a small church, which you may think, oh, small church, less work, but that's not the case. With the large mega churches, you have very large staff, and that work is spread out in a fair way. I was writing my own messages and curriculum for the youth. I was running an entire children's ministry program by myself, picking out all the songs for every Sunday and leading worship. And so essentially, I was working Monday through Friday all day on my secular job, and then Saturday was my day to get all of my work done for Sunday. Sunday was completely exhausting. So I worked every day of the week at that time with no rest. And after I got my school loans paid off in 2 years, I transitioned to start raising my funds to go to the mission field. So in the Assemblies of God, they don't pay their missionaries. The company builds you a budget based off of where you're going and what type of work you're going to be doing. And then it's up to you to travel around your state, sometimes outside of your state, and solicit churches and individuals to support you either one time with a cash offering or on a recurring monthly basis. And our budgets had 2 parts to it. We had to raise a certain amount of pledged monthly support and a certain amount of cash. Now, when I was done raising funds the first time, I had never raised my monthly budget to 100%. I had enough of a cash overage that they were able to divide it by the number of months that I was going to be there, and so they allowed me to go. And looking back, I don't think I would have ever made it if I hadn't done as much self-funding as I did. We had training that cost money. There was a lot of travel to get to churches. I did a lot of 8-hour drives to get to churches where I would drive out Saturday, preach, and then drive back on Sunday so I could get back to my secular job. I also spent my entire break, Monday through Friday, at my secular job, cold calling churches and pastors and setting up times to meet with them to try to convince them to let me speak, which, even though the Assembly of God claims to be egalitarian, you still have a lot of pastors here and there, since the churches are more or less self-governed. You have pastors here and there who very much believe that a woman shouldn't be allowed to preach. So I had that against me. And because I was a single woman, I was somehow seen as a child. And so it's very difficult to be taken seriously. Even though I had ministerial credentials and had faithfully been an associate pastor at an Assemblies of God church for more than 2 years. I paid for all of my travel and all of my training out of pocket. So because of that, because I chose to not have myself reimbursed for those items were removed from my budget, which lessened the amount of cash that I was required to raise. My time in India is enough of a topic on its own for another video, so I won't be covering that today, but if that's something that you're interested in, please let me know down in the comments, and I can definitely make a video about that in the future. So now let's fast forward to when I returned from India. So my first time going through it, I went as a missionary associate. Even though I could go as fully appointed the first time out, because I had served at a church for 2 years, and that would have fit the requirements, I felt that it was wise, since it would be the longest time I had spent overseas, the most before being 2 months, that I felt it was wise to just do a 2-year term for the first time out of the gate, which also makes the budget smaller and a little bit easier to raise. So when I came back, the first thing I did was immediately go through the process to go from being a missionary associate to a fully appointed missionary. That went smoothly. The thing that wasn't going smoothly during that time, however, was I wasn't able to move back in with my parents, which is most likely for the best, because when I was in India, they moved from my home state to another state quite far away. And so my home state is where I'm known. It's where there are churches that already support me. It's where all of my connections are. So I had to live out of that state for raising my funds. I definitely didn't have the money to fly out to churches like some of these really well-known missionaries are able to do. So I had to have my own place, and between having to pay rent to have a room in a house full of a bunch of other people, between that and food and gas and travel, I racked up a ridiculous amount of credit card debt. Because the amount of money that I was getting month to month, which was enough to live in India, minus the amount of supporters that fell off, and the fact that I had never raised that budget 100% in the first place, it was certainly not enough to make ends meet in America. So I got in pretty heavy debt, which now my husband and I are working diligently to pay off. Otherwise, the process from missionary associate to fully appointed missionary, that went very smoothly. I was enjoying the community for the new area that I was going to be serving in, and I was really looking forward to being back overseas again, because it was the best times of my life. And even though there were struggles, it was an environment that I loved. After I got that full appointment, I went back to, again, soliciting churches and individuals to support me monthly. And it was even harder than last time. I love public speaking. I love getting up in front of a group of people and sharing what I'm passionate about. Every place that I did get to go to and share, I would get rave reviews. I'd get so much positive feedback. I'd have congregation members coming up and asking for my slides, for my notes. But those were few and far between because I could not get these appointments booked. It was just so hard as a single female to get the attention of any of these pastors. And I started to really feel like a failure because this was my one thing. This was the culmination of my entire life. This is what I was meant to be doing. This is the one thing God had created me for, I felt. And so, what do you have? What do you have left when you're incapable of doing the one thing you're supposed to be doing? And I fell into a pretty deep depression because I felt like a complete failure. And trigger warning, I started to really think about how to end it all. At the time, I was still a very, very avid hiker, and I figured that the best course of action would be to stage a little accident for myself, because I thought that would be easier. It's really difficult when someone you really love, someone you really care about, chooses to end things. Because you always blame yourself. You wonder, what could I have done? How did I not notice? And you blame yourself no matter what. And I didn't want to put others in that position. I thought it would be much easier for them if I had some sort of accident, because yes, it would be sad, but it would be an accident. They wouldn't be blaming themselves for not noticing how depressed I was. All they would see is a girl who loves hiking, was a little too ambitious with her hiking, and I actually got myself into a position where I was stuck on a very narrow, crumbly piece of rock. Had to have one foot in front of the other because you couldn't put them next to each other. And either side would be falling to my death. There was no going forward, and it seemed impossible to go back as my feet would slip. And I thought, at last, this is it. Finally. Thanks to a pretty severe dissociative disorder, I don't recall what happened next, but came to in the car a few hours away from that place. Which was the push to finally get into therapy. Not because I wanted to end everything, but because I lost a big chunk of time. And as I was looking back on my life, I was recalling other times where I had lost chunks of time that my brain had kind of made me look past, forget. And so I ended up in therapy for a dissociative disorder. Which I, full disclosure, I have a psychiatric diagnosis of dissociative and identity disorder. I have no intention of making my channel about that. YouTube channels about D.I.D. actually turned me away from getting help years and years ago, because there was a time when I was younger where I kind of suspected there was something wacky going on, and I found out about dissociative identity disorder. I thought, well, that could be it. And I watched YouTube videos of like switching, meet my alters, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, well, I don't have that. So I didn't get help. So I'm not a fan of those channels. Those are not my experiences with the disorder. I don't relate to those. I have no desire to make that type of content. So really, I don't intend to mention it again. And I think that's for the best. It is pretty controversial. I think thanks to media portrayals and some of those social media portrayals. The fact that I have D.I.D. I don't think is very relevant to the type of content that I would like to make. As far as mental illnesses go, I think probably the most relevant would be my complex PTSD, because it does arise from the indoctrination and the religious trauma and the very abusive family and home life that I grew up into. And so if I ever do mention or bring up those things again, it's probably going to be related to my religious upbringing and borderline cult programming that I went through as a child. After my attempt and subsequent reaching out to therapy, that's when I really started to doubt. And that's when I came to the realization that, one, a lot of my relationship with God was based off of my relationship with my own father and how I was raised. And that by virtue of that, my relationship with God was extremely unhealthy. My self-worth was completely based off of what I could accomplish for him, just as my self-worth with my parents was on getting 100% and A's in school. As a child, I was punished if I wasn't achieving perfection, because they knew I could do better. I mean, forget that later on that when my brother was struggling in school, they implemented a system where they paid him for grades all the way down for a C. But no, I had to get A's. And if it was an A minus, oh no. Oh no. Which, don't get me wrong, I love my brother. I don't blame him at all. We both have our trauma from growing up in the situation that we were born into. And so I realized that it's not healthy. And so my intentions were to take a step back and try to learn everything from the beginning. You know, like I was a new believer, a new convert. And I went to someone who was very much a second mom. She was my religious mentor, and I was very nervous to let her know that I was having doubts, that I was struggling, but she was very nice and was talking about how excited she was that I had a chance to start from the beginning and see how loving and kind and faithful God is. And she was completely convinced that if I was wholeheartedly seeking after God, he would reveal himself to me. And I did. And he didn't. And as time went on, I began to allow myself to think about things that I'd pushed aside. See, between my Bible college and other classes that I took, I had extensive exegetical training, church history training, and biblical history training. Exegesis is the process of looking at a scripture and figuring out all the context around that scripture, what was happening historically at the time, who wrote it, who was it written to, what did it mean for the people of that day, etc. You know, maybe identifying figures of speech. Because of all of this training, I was already in the know about a lot of things that your average Christian doesn't think about. I already knew that the Gospels weren't written by the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that physically walked with Jesus. I already knew that these authors were unknown. I knew about the potential Q source that these Gospels maybe were using as reference. I knew about some of the dubious lack of historical records for Hebrew slaves in Egypt, the Exodus, obviously the worldwide biblical flood with Noah. I was already not a young earth creationist. From my study, it was very clear that Genesis and the creation story is poetry. But then you go to the New Testament and they speak of the creation of Adam and Eve as if it's fact, which is curious. And so I started to let myself really think about these things. I also rejected the possibility of humans evolving. I was totally okay with every other animal evolving, but that was a sticking point for me. If we were made in God's image, well, we couldn't have evolved from other things. That wouldn't be God's image, right? And so I started looking and digging more into historical inaccuracies, thinking more about what was and wasn't chosen to be biblical canon, so the books that we have in the Bible today, as opposed to other books that were written around that time, that some of them are even referenced by the books of the Bible that we have. And I started looking more into evolution and began to doubt more and more and more the faith I had held for my entire life. At that time, it was really difficult because I felt so deeply remorseful, because if what I had dedicated my entire life to wasn't true, what a waste. What a waste of my life. How could I have been so stupid, so foolish? And also this great fear. My family is extremely religious. Because I went to a Bible school, all of my close friends are Christians. They're also pastors and missionaries and worship leaders and all hold very strong faith. And my husband is very into apologetics. So there was just this immense fear of, if I realize that this isn't true and I stop believing in God, what's going to happen to my relationship with my family, to my friends? Is my husband still gonna love me? Is he gonna want to stick around? Is he gonna try to convert me? Thankfully, I kept my husband informed this whole process, and he at no point has tried to convert me. We only have conversations on my terms when I'm ready to talk about things, and he's always very patient, understanding, and compassionate. We're very good on this topic about agreeing to disagree, because you'll find when you look into a lot of these things, it's very easy to find lots of sources that say lots of different things on different topics. And so he might say something about time period something was written, and I was like, well, that's not what I found. I found that it was this. And we're okay with not agreeing on things. And we still have a really good, really loving relationship. I'm only sad because he's sad, because he feels that I'm missing out on eternal life, which I don't think I ever really wanted anyway. At least not as how the little bit we get to see in the Bible of what that is allegedly like. It doesn't seem like a good time. I much would prefer annihilation. So after a while, I stopped thinking about it actively because it was just a little too much. I think I had a lot of subconscious processing that needed to happen because there were so many beliefs that I had held so strongly for such a long time that they're so beaten in and ingrained, and there's just this huge level of mental resistance that you come up against when you've been brainwashed your entire life. And so I took a break from thinking about it actively, and I can't tell you the calendar date, but I woke up one day, was brushing my teeth, and I had this sudden realization that God's not real, and I don't believe in him. And I felt just this massive sense of relief because now, well, all of my mental and genetic and physical problems, that wasn't some creator making me defective and then asking ridiculous things of me. I was just a product of genetics and evolution. And sure, I got dealt a bad hand, but I also can now give myself permission to take care of myself in a way that I can function normally. I don't have to push myself to the brink all the time or achieve ridiculous standards that I had set for myself, thinking that that was what God would want. And now, the people around me were just people. They're no longer projects. I no longer have to worry about the state of their mortal souls. I no longer need to feel guilt going into work and not trying to convert my coworkers. It also meant that things that I had secretly held, I could now truly hold. I never truly felt that being straight was the only correct and holy way to be. I myself had had crushes on women since middle school, which again was another, God, why would you make me this way? And so it was also that relief of, I can now be sex positive and supportive of people no matter who they're attracted to, as long as it's consensual. One of the things that's really helped me is the variety of atheist content here on YouTube. So some of the ones that really spoke to me were Apologia, or Pelagia, if you're if you're William Lane Craig, which I don't get. He's an apologist. Apologia. Like, where's I swear he does it on purpose. So anyway, some of the channels that were really inspiring and helpful to me were Apologia, Genetically Modified Skeptic, The Antibot, and Apostate Ashley. So I figured I would try my hand at it. I think one of the things that was holding me back before was I felt like there wasn't space for me. I have a habit of being like a liquid. I take up the space I think is allotted towards me. So if that's overseas and they want me to be the leader of a team, I'll do it. I'll fill that space. But when I'm at a church and they're only giving me a 3-minute window to speak because I'm a woman, I'm small and I'm submissive and I only take up that space. And so the thing that stopped me from trying my hand at YouTube a little bit earlier in this process is that I felt that there wasn't space. And I'm tired of telling myself things like that and limiting myself to my perceived expectations from other people. So I'm going to give it a try. And if it works, it works. If not, well, I don't know. Who knows? Who knows what I'll try next? Thank you all so much for taking the time and listening to my story. I hope there was something in it that helped you or resonated with you. And you're very much welcome to come along on this journey.